Welcome everybody to B+LNZ Genetics Beef Breeders webinar. There are only 38 of quite a few registered on, but we will get cracking because we have some great content over the next hour and then the half an hour of question and answers. So I'll just flick through and just welcome everybody. Wayne, if you could just turn your camera on, please. So just to begin with, I am Anna Boyd and I am the Beef Genetics Specialist for B+LNZ Genetics. So hopefully you've seen my face or seen my name in articles recently. I lead all kind of research work associated with B+LNZ Genetics, and I'm also the person of contact between breeders, stud breeders, as well as commercial breeders and the organisation. So tonight we also have speaking Wayne Pitchford. So Wayne will be up first. He is a professor in animal science at University of Adelaide. He's director of J.S. Davies Research Centre and previously the project lead for maternal productivity within the Australian beef CRC. Wayne works closely with both the beef and sheep industries in Australia and New Zealand. His primary interest has been in genetics and genomics. Wayne has been focused on maternal productivity, feed efficiency, carcass and meat quality. He has also conducted genomic analysis of 2 commercial beef breeding programs. After Wayne is our very own Jason Archer, Dr. Jason Archer. So Jason is our genetics specialist livestock for B+LNZ Genetics. Jason, who has a PhD in animal breeding and genetics, started his career in the Australian beef industry, working on feed efficiency. Apparently he was actually one of Wayne's first PhD students. Since moving back to New Zealand, Jason has worked for Ag Research, Abacus Bio, and now Beef and Lamb. While with Abacus, Jason worked with several North American and Australian breed associations, as well as contracting to Beef and Lamb to set up and run the initial B+LNZ Genetics or Beef Progeny Test that originated in, or first mating in 2014. So I'm 5 minutes ahead of schedule, which is fantastic, and I'm going to pass over to Wayne.
So a real privilege to be able to speak to you tonight, both on 2 fronts. I looked through some of the people that had logged in, and there was a lot of familiar names, and both a privilege and a sense of responsibility to be talking to so many familiar people, but also to be presenting alongside of Jason tonight is a real privilege as well. I don't think of him as my first PhD student. I think of him as a close friend, and we have now been friends for a very, very long time, which is amazing when we're not that old. Hey, Jason. So I'll move through my presentation. I thought I'd start tonight with a quote from an Angus breeder, and a number of you have heard me use this quote before, but I want to revisit this a few times as we go through the presentation. This is a really, really small part of a long interview that was occurred with that Angus breeder. And they said, I use the carcass traits more for maternal productivity than for carcass. It's huge. Rib and rump, whenever I use an AI sire, I have a really good look at his fat EBVs. Yeah, whenever I use a negative fat bull, which is a below average genetically fat bull, the dropout rate in our maternal side is too high. I know the feedlot buyer wants high yielding steers, but I can't afford that in the cow herd. So this is the sort of thing that Jason and I are going to talk through tonight, and sort of thinking through the relationships between body condition or fatness in cows and reproduction, maternal productivity. And we've got some. It's not only talking about data that is now getting quite old, but we've got some recent data as well, some of which is helpful, maybe not all of it. So here's a graph from our beef CRC slides, and some of you will have seen this before. On the vertical axis, I've got pregnancy rate, and then on the horizontal axis, the parity, first parity, so the heifer joining, and then second parity, rebreeding, third parity, and so forth. In fact, those third parity ones at 3.5, it's an average of third and fourth parity values. And what we had was 2 genetic lines. These are Angus heifers that were brought into the project that represented the top 10% of the breed for, well, the highest 10% of the breed for fatness, for rib fat, and the bottom 10% of the breed for rib fat. So we had high and low fat lines. And then we fed them on high and low nutrition. And this is not fatness. The fatness graph looks more extreme than this. If you fed them more, they got fatter. But sure enough, as you fed them more, so each of them, the higher values, ended up with higher pregnancy rates. But there was a difference in pregnancy rate between the high and low fat line, the high fat line being higher than the low fat line. But then the rebreeding rates, those differences were slightly smaller. And then as mature cows, those differences were basically non-existent. And certainly, if you took out the cows, if you had culled the cows for infertility, those that were remaining sort of continued to be productive across both of those lines. This is reflected in this graph here, where I've got the blue line being the high genetic fat lines and the yellow line being the low genetic fat lines. And I've only presented the low nutrition values here because that represents closer to the way that commercial cattle would be run. And on the vertical axis here, it's not just what percentage were pregnant, but what percentage of them were both lactating and pregnant. So this is actually rebreeding rate for the young cow. So to achieve a value here, the young cow needed to have got in calf as a heifer, successfully taken that through to birth, had that calf, successfully had that calf, and then be lactating. And then how many of those that did that were then, how many of those actually got pregnant? And there was a difference between the high and low fat lines. Those that were genetically fatter, the greater the percentage of them were actually both lactating and pregnant than the low fat line. You'll see me later refer to something which is WAP or even WAPE, but WAP, they're wet and pregnant in that they're lactating and pregnant at the time. Now, the downside here is the low fat ones, there's only 2/3 of them that are actually doing the job, that says. But as mature cows, so after their first rebreed, which is the data represented here, they then go on and have their second calf, and during their second lactation and third lactations, and they're rejoined, no difference between the lines at all. And the value is pretty high, sort of close to 90% there. So there's a few messages there that it looks like that there is a difference between the fat lines, and there's a difference between young cows and mature cows, but also the difference between the fat lines didn't hold up in the mature cows. So we then started looking at, well, if we were actually going to predict pregnancy rate relative to pre-joining weight, and then this is a function in this data, there was a function of weight and fatness. So this is done at a condition score 2.5. Now that's on a 5-point Australian scale. I think that would be equivalent to about a 5 on a 9-point scale. So of those that are 5, here's the range of pre-joining weights, and those that are heavier were more likely to get pregnant, especially under a 6-week joining. And certainly if you gave them a longer joining period, then the effective weight is smaller. So it says not only are they more likely to get in calf, but they're more likely to get in calf quickly. We then looked at that relative to fatness, and this is now predicting at 400 kilos. Probably if I had my time again, I would have predicted this at a lighter weight, but in the CRC data at the time, that was our thinking, was maybe they actually need to be a lot heavier than what we had thought previously. So this prediction was done at 400 kilos, but it shows increasing rib fat, increasing pregnancy rate, and you have better condition heifers, more likely to get them in calf. And again, especially at 6-week joining, although really low fats, that's declining at a rapid rate, even at a 9-week joining. So there's some sort of relationship between fatness and fertility, which we kind of all know, we all see that. But then we need to think about, well, is that a phenotypic relationship or is that a genetic relationship? Could we just manage these differently rather than the genetics of fatness actually being the key issue? So to try and combine the weight and fatness predictions, We did that every 2 millimetres of rib fat depth. We have a different line there, and then different pre-joining weights, and these reflect the range of weights that we actually had. Because we were buying heifers into the project, some of them ended up quite big by the time they were joined. They were a bit older as well. But it's basically saying more weight and more fat is going to give you more pregnancies. And so it backs up that fat story. But we don't normally use weight as a predictor of pregnancy. So in some ways, why should we use fat as a predictor of pregnancy as well, given that both of those are important and maybe they're just phenotypic messages. So then the all-important thing from a genetics point of view is we said, well, that's all good. Which of the breeding values that we currently have in our standard set of breeding values, which breeding values are the best ones at predicting the pregnancy rate outcome? And we did that for a 6 and a 9 week joining. And in fact, the only breeding value that was significant was the days to calving breeding value. It wasn't actually the rib fat breeding value. And with the days to calving breeding value, a negative value represents an animal that gets into calf faster, so a shorter time to get into calf. And sure enough, the more negative values genetically, the faster they got in, or the higher the pregnancy rate. And that's a slightly steeper slope under a 6 week joining versus a 9 week joining. These were all actually joined for 9 weeks, and then based on the time of calving was how we separated them out into their 6 or 9 week joining period. So the most important genetic bit is actually the days to calving EBV, not the fat EBV. Let's just lock that one in for a minute. I then went on and we were involved in running a black baldy project, and we had a commercial herd that was run on country that was let's say they were very, very good at utilising pasture. Any plant that poked its head out of the ground got eaten pretty quickly. They were stocked up pretty heavy. And they were in a cold environment, cold, windy environment that was actually run on a wind farm in Tasmania. And apparently it's the most reliable source of electricity off a wind farm of all the wind farms in Australia. So that tells you about how windy it was. They're a really large cow herd, about 5,000 Angus cows. And in this trial, the animals that we were using were mated to either Angus, so they were purebred Angus calves, or to Hereford, so we had black baldy calves. What I've got here is the percentage of them that were weaned. So of the 100% of the heifers that were weaned for the 2 breed crosses, how many of them were there in the mob when we scanned them for whether they were pubertal or not? So we did ovarian scanning, Dave Warburton and Neil Sanderson have been part of training our group in that. Ovarian scanning, and then how many of them were there actually at joining. There were some of them that were deemed too light to join, so they were taken out of the group. That's why that went down. And then of those that were joined, how many were pregnant? So pregnancy tested in calf is a term, PTIC is an Australian term. I'm not sure if you use that term. And then of those, how many actually calved? And then of those that calved, how many ended up lactating because either the cow or the heifer or the calf didn't die, they survived. And then of those, how many of those were then joined, or at least that we had records that they were joined. And then of those, how many got back in calf? And the only place we actually saw a significant breed difference was actually in that rebreeding rate, where the Hereford crosses, slightly more of them got in calf than the purebred Angus. And when we actually looked at whether that was a heterosis effect or a breed effect, there was actually a significant breed effect there. And I'll cover that in this next slide. So some of the messages from the black baldy trial that we've only just recently finished writing up. The heterosis or the hybrid vigour effect was significant for the percentage that were pubertal, but not actually significant for the number of heifers that were pregnant, which was a surprise to us. The attainment of puberty was actually not a good predictor of pregnancy outcome. In the first year, and we had 3 years of the trial, in the first year, only half of them were pubertal going into mating, but of the half that weren't pubertal, 85% of those got in calf. And so being pubertal meant that they got in calf slightly quicker, but it wasn't a great indicator of pregnancy. Thankfully, I guess, the days to calving EBV, of the sire, their dad, was related to the percentage of heifers that were pubertal, the heifer pregnancy rate, and the rebreed rate. So that was really good, that was significant for all three, that breeding value is doing what you'd expect it to do. And the regression coefficient, or the actual effect, was that 1 day less on the days to calving breeding value resulted in about 1% better, 1% more pubertal, 1% more heifer pregnancies, 1% more rebreeding rate. So the days to calving EBV is always a bit odd to explain, but it is not dissimilar to weaning rate. The scrotal EBV of the sires is also an interesting one, where we actually hope that reflects age at puberty. And sure enough, the scrotal EBV of the dads was related to the percent of heifers, percent of their daughters that were pubertal. I just can't remember the exact relationship there, but that was a significant relationship. Didn't actually reflect whether they got pregnant or not, but was significant for whether they were pubertal. So that's good that holds up. And then something I think Jason will show you later is that in terms of genetic variation, there was actually more genetic variation in that rebreed than what there was in heifer pregnancy. Our values here are slightly higher than what Jason will present, but it does back up that there's slightly more genetic variation in the rebreed, which is a slightly different message from what I'm about to show you. We've been running a trial which is MLA funded, Meat and Livestock Australia funded, and it's to try and develop sort of growth targets for heifers and then rebreeding cows, growth and condition targets from a management point of view. And so this has actually not got genetics in it as such, it's just from a management point of view. And so what I've got here on the vertical axis is the conception rate, or the preg test rate, versus the start of mating weight. And we fetal age them, so we're able to get them into different cycles. And sure enough, if you have higher start mating weight, then you end up with more that are in calf. And possibly there was some indication that really high values end up possibly going down. But these curves really are pretty dodgy. I should just explain the difference between the pink and the purple here. The pink is the herd average. So that's one particular herd. How many got in calf in the first 3 weeks or the first cycle? And then the purple is how many were in calf in the first 2 cycles. And so there's actually a purple dot above a pink dot, should be in all cases, or all cases where we could get the data. And so I'm not that confident about those relationships. And hopefully you can see on a herd average point of view that there's actually quite a lot of variation around those relationships. So if we said 350 kilos was a good target for starter mating weight, there was actually a very big variation in the outcome at that weight. Turns out it's actually quite frustrating. So we then went to look at the variation within herds rather than between herds. And we wanted to show, this is pregnancy rate again on the vertical axis versus joining weight. And we've got a much bigger range of joining weights now because this is individual animals within each of those herds. And what we'd really like is a really nice curve that sort of starts really low and then goes up like a sigmoidal curve and then ends up with a high pregnancy outcome, and then on the top end goes down. But hopefully you can see that there's just herds going all over the place. So these are different lines that are for different herds and also for different years within the same herd. And some of them are showing trends like we expect. Some of them go the opposite way. That's actually one that used a single shot AI with no backup bull and had a very low pregnancy rate overall. And the heavier ones were actually worse in that year. This dotted line here is actually the same herd the following year when they used natural mating and got a stronger relationship. Part of I think this tells me a couple of things. One is that to develop general recommendations for industry is much harder than I expected. The other thing it tells me is there's a bit of a difference between spring and autumn calving systems, or a lot of our spring calving systems would be late winter. And when heifers are being mated at absolutely the right time for pasture quality and quantity, and you know, they're absolutely cherry ripe during the mating program, the relationship with joining weight is much weaker. So a lot of these very flat lines are the ones that were joining in sort of in the peak of the growing season of the feed, or just after the peak of the growing season of the feed. So sort of mid-spring in our language. Might be late spring in your language. So yeah, that's kind of been tough. In terms of showing you some specific values from these herds, here's the 9 herds across different years. And one of those, we got 2 herds that were autumn calving herds, herd 1 and 4. One of the herds actually did an experiment. They put they had their standard treatment for their heifers on flat, good country, and then they put some up in some hills with poorer quality pasture, and looked at how they actually went. And what I want to show here is that we went through and looked at their first heifer pregnancy rates. And if you look through these, I think many of you would be on the high end of these values. That 34% was that one that had the single shot AI, so that probably discard that from the data. But some of these are in the 50s and certainly 60s. You know, not that high for heifer pregnancy rates. If you then looked at the rebreeding rate, well, I'm here at 98, which is quite outstanding. There's quite a few there in the high 80s. And in fact, the only one that's not reasonably good in the 80s is this 76. And that particular herd, both for that heifer pregnancy and that rebreeding rate, that's the same year, the same joining. And there was evidence of a reproductive disease in that herd in that year. So that's a bit of an outlier. So one of the things that we look at is this measure of weight, which is wet and pregnant, and then the E is for early. Early we define as being pregnant in the first 6 weeks of joining as a rebreeder. And if a cow really has got in calf as a heifer, successfully calved, be raising a calf, got back in calf quite quickly, then she's ready to rock and roll and do the job from then on. So we see this as an important measure. And lots of these values for weight are quite low. I've circled those that are in the 40s and 50s. That's saying of the heifers that were joined, there's quite a few that actually are not making it through to being mature cows. That's a bit of a concern. And then we say, well, where is the issue? Why are they not doing that? And we thought that the rebreeding rates would have been where the issue was, but in fact, it's actually more driven by these lower heifer conception rates rather than the rebreeding rates. And so I said a minute ago that the heritability of the rebreeding rate is higher than the heifer joining, but from a management point of view, it looks like that heifer one is what's driving the variation or the low value in weight in some of our herds. I now want to talk a bit about body condition. This is back to some of the CRC data. Some of you will have seen this graph before, but I've got body condition here on the vertical axis, and it's looking at the range of condition of the different lines. And the higher line here is, or the blue line is the genetically high fat line. The black line is the genetically low fat line. The dotted ones are high nutrition. So the high nutrition line were fatter, as you'd expect, than the low nutrition. But still went on a roller coaster, and the low nutrition, they went on a roller coaster at a level that was much closer to industry. And I think that body condition of 2.5 might be similar about to your 5 out of 9 or 10 scores, just to try and benchmark things. The point I want to make here is that body condition in cows is not just about reproduction. It's not just about getting them back in calf, but it's actually managing them, their health and future productivity as well. In Australia, when cows lose condition too much, it triggers supplementary feeding decisions. And so if they are losing too much condition or falling or are into lower condition, then you have to start supplementary feeding early. And that's a key performance indicator or a key profit driver in our businesses. In hill country in New Zealand, you may not be driven so much by the supplementary feed, but if they're losing condition too much and are not able to be healthy and vital in that country, then they're going to start dropping out of the system, eventually manifest as not getting in calf, but possibly issues even before that. So then one of the things that I've done recently is gone back and looked at that early beef CRC data and come right back to that quote at the start of the presentation to say, well, now that we've collected the data, how much of the variation in cow body composition is actually associated with yielding body composition? And I'm doing that from a genetics point of view, not from a phenotypic point of view. So what I did was I had 5 yielding traits. I had yielding weight, rump fat, rib fat, intramuscular fat, and eye muscle area. And then I had all of those traits measured in cows. And in addition to that, I also had height and body condition score measured in the cows. So I actually have there 12 traits. But what I did was I took the cow data and I did a bit of jiggery-pokery with matrix manipulation to say how much of the cow data, how much variation in the cow data, genetic variation in cow data, is present when it's independent of that yearling data. And so what I've got in this graph is the percentage of the variation, genetic variation in each of the trait for cows, which is either associated with yielding traits, and the green is associated, and the yellow is independent of yielding traits. And what I want to do is jump right over to the right and show you something that's quite interesting. And that says that 3/4 or 75% of the variation in body condition score in cows is actually independent of the 5 yielding traits that people are actually thinking that they're using to actually manage cow body composition. So I actually found that quite fascinating that it would be that high. So it's a trait that's almost independent of those yielding traits. Okay, so I'll wrap up now, and I think surprisingly for me, I'm pretty close to right on time. For me, there's some take-home messages, and I've got 2 slides here, one for cows and one for bulls. The reason to separate them is that the cows are the ones that we actually manage, where the bulls are the ones where a lot of our genetic improvement actually comes from. The way that I've been saying it to Australian producers with the cow messages is nurture the teenagers and push the old girls. And the reason we say that is the old cows that have actually done the job, they've actually got in calf as a heifer, they've had that calf, raised that calf, got back in calf, and the ones that have done that quickly, they're pretty robust units. And we reckon that in a lot of Australian systems, we could actually utilise more pasture by pushing them a bit harder. But don't push the whole herd so hard that you actually limit your pregnancy rate in the heifers, because that's actually where we see a significant profit driver for Australian herds. And that's even more pointy at the moment as we're in a herd rebuilding phase following drought. And then a couple of comments, which the specifics of may not be so important, but the generalities may be real. If you're getting 95% of your cows in calf, then run more cows, utilise more pasture. But if you're only getting 70% of your cows in calf, then run less cows. It's less management. You could actually have more feed going into production, less going into maintenance, and possibly be more profitable. We reckon that about 60% of your heifers are needed to be in calf to provide replacements. And a key message to studs, and actually this message should come from clients of studs is there's two key breeding values that we need good information on. One is the days to calving breeding value, and so that means studs need to be recording it. And same goes for a cow body condition score breeding value. Now, the Angus breed in Australia now has breeding values for both body condition score as well as days to calving. That's something that we should be pushing our studs to be recording so the information goes in the system so that then we can get breeding values on those. And then last slide, take-home messages around bulls. So bull selection drives genetic gain. The key thing is not exactly the which bull you buy, but which driveway you go down, because you're often buying a team of bulls. So you need to be aligning yourself to a stud that's going in the right direction. Then when you choose a bull, select on a balanced breeding objective, check out whether there's extreme breeding values for particular traits that might be a problem. And extreme EBVs, I treat these a bit like being like a fault. And check for visual structural soundness, and obviously that's important. I've put it right down here because I reckon usually people place too much importance on it. It's not to say it's unimportant, but it's actually, it's something that should go as part of the package. And then the key thing is focus on getting the best truckload possible. Get yourself a good team of bulls rather than worrying about individual bulls, and away you go with a really good team. So on that note, thank you very much for listening. I really do count it a privilege to be able to share with you tonight.
Awesome. I am very impressed with your timing, Wayne. So what we're going to do is we're just going to flip back to our side of the ditch now, and it is Jason's turn. So Jason, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. And like Wayne, it's great to be able to talk to a group of people who are interested in maternal performance in beef. And so I guess my brief in a way was to listen to Wayne and say what is similar, what's different to what we've found in New Zealand. And you'll see a lot of similarities. I'm going to say a lot of the same things and maybe one or two differences, some of which we can probably explain, others of which maybe we can't. And so maternal performance in our beef progeny test, I won't cover every aspect of maternal performance because we haven't got the time for that, but I'm going to pick out probably two or three main points that I think are the highlights that have come out of it. Before I do, I'll just acknowledge a huge amount of people that actually went into running this project, and the project's it's actually still ongoing in terms of its data collection at these original sites, but just in terms of acknowledgements, Anna, who is our operations manager and runs these sites, and previous before her in that role was Max Tweedy, who also made a large contribution. Craig Foots does a lot of the on-the-ground measurement, data recording, and has been a really vital part of the project right from the start. And especially tonight, I should mention Franzi Vike. So Franzi's a PhD student. She's actually a month or two away from finishing her PhD. Also supervised by myself, but also Beck Hicks and Steve Morris and Dorian Garrick, and Massey University's funded her. Franzi's from Germany originally, actually. And pretty much everything I'm going to present tonight is out of her PhD. So she really should get a lot of credit for doing the analysis. And then, of course, we had this project on 5 farms, and the owners of the farms and managers of the farms and the teams at the BPT sites all deserve a huge amount of kudos because they put a huge effort in. And I see one or two of the names on the call tonight are people who were part of the project or started in the project and then moved on to a different farmer, etc. So Silverfern Farms, also, we've killed all our cattle through Silverfern Farms and got the grading information through them. So thanks very much to Melissa for that. And there's a bunch of other service providers, and of course funded by B+LNZ Genetics, but also Focus Genetics and Simontel New Zealand. So none of this would happen without a large team of people. So I'll just briefly outline the project. Probably, I suspect a lot of you have probably heard me talk about this project before because it's been around for a while. So I won't spend too much time on it. But essentially, the project was on 5 farms. They're all large farms ranging from about 35,000 stock units up to about 90,000 stock units. So they're big commercial operations. and 3 in the North Island, just north of Gisborne, Central Plateau, Southern Hawke's Bay, and then 2 in the South Island, 1 in North Canterbury, near Cheviot, and 1 in the Hacker Valley. And we had we used a range of bulls. So there's about 50 bulls a year, which was about right. We had Shirley, Hereford, Stabiliser, Angus, and Simmental in there, and we inseminated a bit over 2,000 cows a year for most of the years. Tonight, what we actually did is we retained daughters from Hereford, Angus, and Stabiliser into the herds, but Shirley and Simmental, all the progeny were killed. So really, what you're looking at tonight is progeny that are Hereford, Stabiliser, and Angus sired, and over either Angus or Hereford cows. And so this probably slide says much the same thing. So we used a bunch of different bulls, made them over a bunch of cows. The steers were all processed, and we got carcass quality on them. We also did ultrasound scans, so the fat depth, eye muscle area, and intramuscular fat. And then the heifers also got ultrasound scanned. We mated them, and they went back into the herd, and as 3-year-old cows ended up back in the herd as for artificial insemination. So just to burrow a little bit more onto what we did with the females, and this is the sort of the lifetime of a typical, well, not the lifetime, but the first 3 years, I guess, of a heifer. So at 15 months, we mated all the heifers as yearlings. We'd preg scan them, of course, at 18 months, and we fetal aged them. And we used technicians that were capable of fetal aging down to about a 5-day increment. So we get really good fetal age data, and we're lucky in New Zealand because we have a bunch of those technicians there, because they scan so many dairy cows where they have a known AI date. They get very good at it. So they calved out as 2-year-olds. You can see down the bottom, we saw them 3 times a year and weighed them and did body condition scores, and once a year did a hip height. So that first mating was natural service. The second mating was natural service as well, because that's where we want to look at rebreeding. And then as 3-year-olds, they would then go into the AI herd for the most part. So they would get AI'd and followed up. And just in terms of what we're talking about tonight, I'm sort of calling a heifer anything up to about 24 months till she first calves. Then calling her a 2-year-old, and I often use the word rebreeding, and yes, cows rebreed, but I'm focusing on rebreeding after that first calf. And then anything over 3, we're sort of calling a mixed age cow in terms of the data. So what do we get? And Wayne showed his roller coaster graph. Well, this is our roller coaster graph. 4 herds here, because we're talking about mixed age cows, and at Cabernet, most of the animals are actually younger than mixed age. So these are the 4 herds, A, B, C, and D, down in the panels going downwards. And on the left-hand side, we've got weight, and on the right-hand side, we've got condition score measured on a 1 to 10 scale, which is the scale we tend to use in New Zealand. So you can just see that different properties actually did different things in terms of how much they swung those cows up and down. And so the property B in particular really took weight off and put it back on quite deliberately. That property is actually Rangatyke Station up on the Napier-Taupo Highway in the Central Plateau. And property D did something quite similar, but had a couple of severe droughts during the project. So maybe at times didn't hit the highs that they would have liked to have. Property A, which is Whangarā Farms up near Gisborne, and property C, which is in Tautani Station in the Southern Hawke's Bay, actually the weights on those cows were much more stable, and it's probably it's a management style thing, and it's probably also to do with the risk of that summer autumn dry period at those particular places. And of course, as you'd expect, condition score sort of follows live weight. So that's what those places look like. So Wayne's already essentially talked about this relationship, and which is between body condition score and how many, what's our pregnancy rate. I quite like this graph because I do a lot of thinking about this and base a lot of my thoughts around it. But I will emphasize this is the phenotype. It's not the genotype. And Wayne made that same point when he was talking about his. So this is actually the pregnancy rate after the AI program, and we've with the data we've made sure that it's a 49-day pregnancy rate. So had they been joined for 49 days, so that's basically AI. They then get naturally followed up, and you'd expect them to recycle around about 21 days, and they generally do, and then again around 42 days, and they are starting to spread out their pregnancies at that point of time. The synchrony effect is diminishing markedly. So this is the 49-day pregnancy rate that we got. You can see there that really you need to make sure you get those cows to condition score 6 to get a halfway decent result. So as a target, as a management target, some people say 6. I like to say 7 because I want a bit more, and I also think that you're going to get a little bit more than just pregnancy rate. You're going to get some earlier pregnancies as well, which I'll talk about. When we actually looked at the chance of success to the single AI insemination, I expected to see much the same sort of relationship, an increase and then a tailing off. But actually, when we looked at that, what we found is that essentially the better condition you're in, right up to score 9, which is a pretty fat cow, the better result you got from that AI. So I actually found that very interesting, and then start sort of thinking about, well, why is that versus the curve that we see as the total pregnancy rate. So it's interesting to think about, and I actually sat down and made up a little bit of a spreadsheet model as to what could be going on. And so if I put those body condition scores down the left hand side there, and then worked out a conception rate and I basically took it off that graph. So at 4 we're getting about 40%, and at 8 say we're getting about 60%, essentially going up in about 5% increments on that line. And then what would happen if you mated those cows and then had them for the first cycle, second cycle, and third cycle? And I've sort of assumed that 3% of the cows won't cycle. So this is a herd of 100. And you can see the overall outcome from this little model in the column that says total. And you sort of get largely what you'd expect and a response, and the more cows pregnant for the higher condition scores. But actually, the real difference is how many get pregnant in the first cycle. Because if you look at the second cycle, almost the same number of cows get pregnant in the second cycle regardless. And that's because there's actually more cows still left empty to mate at the lower conception rates than there are at the higher conception rates. So it sort of averages it out by the time you get to there, and a little bit of difference in the third cycle. But that first cycle, according to this model anyway, is actually where you get the differences. So it's about early calves. And then I'd sort of put that through to financials. And, if you look at those financials and look at 58 compared to, say, 66 or 68, you're talking about sort of a 12 to 17% increase in revenue from that herd. So that's all very well. So, but that's a model. What does it look like? How does that compare to our reality? So I've got the model graphed on the left hand side, and the actual results on the same sort of scale. So the y-axis is about the same on the right hand side, and you can see that actually, if you think about COVID modelling in the last 2 years, we've all learned that you don't actually believe in models, and you make sure you don't fall in love with your own model, because modelers tend to fall in love with their own models. I thought that spreadsheet was pretty slick, and then you look at it and think, well, actually, no, something else is going on that I haven't explained there. But we can still make a comparison and say, well, at condition scores 4 and 5, actually the results are a lot worse than what my model says. And probably at 6 and 7, they're a significant amount better, and 8 and 9, they're about right. So in actual fact, that financial impact that I just talked about then, in terms of going from condition score 4 to condition score 6, that's actually much bigger than what my little model would actually suggest. So again, you know, the feed invested to get an animal into that condition score 6 or 7, I'm sure you get a really good return on that feed. So if there's one message from a management point of view tonight, it's get your animals into condition score 6 minimum, 7 preferably. How much does that take? Well, we actually looked across our data set. There's almost 50,000 records here across 9 herds, because we actually had another data set that had a whole lot of information as well. And basically, to go from a 4 to a 5, we only need to put on about 15 kilos. To go from a 5 to a 6 is 22, and so on. You can see down that right-hand column. If you want to simplify that and say, well, what, you know, that's a bit hard to remember. What's a straight line value? It's around about 27. So if you use the rule of thumb to say, well, 27 kilos was equal to 1 change in body condition score, you're not too far off. And actually, you know, at the end, what really counts, which is that lower end, you know, you're exaggerating it, but that's not a bad thing. So yeah, so just sort of think about that. You know, those early kilos to put on, well worth the investment in feed. So now I come to some of our more genetic results and how we've analysed this. And so how have we measured reproduction? So we've actually used 2 traits. One is pregnancy rate, which is just the yes, no. And the other one, we call it days to conception. So we calculate this by looking at a mob and saying, okay, how many days, at what point did this heifer get pregnant? Remember, we're estimating this from our fetal age compared to the very earliest pregnancy in the mob. So the earliest pregnancy gets a day 0. And if this heifer got pregnant 14 days after that, she would get a 14. So based on that fetal age data. The non-pregnant cows, we take the last pregnancy in the mob, so the very last pregnancy that we've observed, and we add 21 days, so 1 cycle to that. So they get the score. Say the last heifer might have got pregnant, you know, 45 days later, then we're going to add 21 to the non-pregnant animal and call that a 66. For those who are familiar with days to calving in breed plan, it's actually essentially the same concept, and I've essentially stolen the ideas from that days to calving type of approach. The difference is days to calving is that it's based on birth date, not on fetal age. So it doesn't. So the days to conception doesn't include gestation length, whereas days to calving incorporates a little bit of that gestation length variation as well. And it's debatable as to whether that's a positive or a negative, but that's how we've done this data set. So what's our performance? And when we look at heifers, we are getting about 88% of those in that middle column pregnant. And then we get to 2-year-olds, we're getting about 92% pregnant. And then our mixed age pregnancies, which remember were mainly from AI programs, followed with a backup bull, an actual service bull. Across the program, we were getting about 93%. So they're actually all pretty good. And at 88% for heifers and 92 for those 2-year-olds, probably quite a bit higher than, especially the 2-year-olds, than most of the results that Wayne was showing. Actually, no, sorry, it's the heifers that Wayne was showing that that were sort of in the 60s and 70s in his work. So they are the heifers. We got quite a higher pregnancy rate. So on the right-hand side, we've got the heritabilities that we estimate. So this is how much genetic variation there is in there. And you can see for heifers, we really struggled, and in fact, pretty much didn't find any meaningful genetic variation in either of the ways that we were measuring reproduction in those heifers. Different story, completely different story when we come to the 2-year-olds and the rebreeding performance. We actually found quite a bit of variation, and at 21%, that heritability for a reproduction trait is quite exciting to a geneticist. It's actually much higher than what I would normally expect for a reproduction trait. So a lot of the action is in the 2-year-olds. In the mixed age cows, and there's a couple of riders on this, which I'll talk about in a minute, but we couldn't find any variation, any genetic variation, any variation between the sires. So, so what does that mean? So again, 2-year-olds, that's where the action is in this data set, that rebreeding performance. The other thing we found is the genetic correlation between pregnancy and days to conception is minus 0.99. So the minus is just because you want a higher pregnancy rate or a lower days to conception. So the fact that you're going different directions. But the 0.99 tells me that these are the same traits. We're measuring the same thing. So so that's a key message. It actually doesn't matter whether we're talking pregnancy rate or days to conception, we're talking about the same trait. So I've tended to talk about days to conception as being its higher heritability. It's a little bit easier to work with as well from a data analysis point of view. So this is what we find in terms of the population. And so each of these columns here is a sire, and what we're representing is what's that sire's mean daughter performance for days to conception. And you can see there's a reasonable range across there, ranging from a bit above 30 as the worst, and you've got to remember smaller is better, to just over, I guess, almost 23 as the best sire there. And you can look at the breed composition and you know, Angus, Hereford, and a handful of stabilizer scattered among them. You know, there's no obvious breed difference there to my mind. You know, there's better bulls and worse bulls in both, or in all breeds. Just to give you an idea of what the days to conception sort of scale is, I took that model that I was talking about before, and it doesn't really matter whether the body condition score part of it is right or not. But if we were getting this conception rate of 40% through to 65%, and we had that in the first cycle, second cycle, third cycle, what would that mean for days to conception? So that means that our days to conception would range from about 39 down to about 20. So actually, you know, a unit of a day, and I think we could say the same thing about days to calving, it is actually a reasonably significant impact on the fertility of your herd. So what are the implications? Well, our heifers are getting pregnant at a good rate, but we are having some reasonably long joinings in that project, I think up to about 63 or 64 days. Couldn't find any influence of genetics on that. Really interested in, so that result differs to the Australian results, differs to what Wayne showed before. It also differs to what we see in the US. So the US, a lot of the breed associations actually have an EBV that they call heifer pregnancy. So because they have an EBV, they must be finding some sire differences. So they are finding differences in how many heifers get pregnant. Whereas in New Zealand, in our project, and you know, we can't say five herds represent all of New Zealand, but they were pretty big herds and they were scattered up and down New Zealand. So we could not find any sire variation. So for first calvers, actually this is where the action is from a genetics point of view. And there is quite a significant impact of sire and genetics on the ability of those animals to rebreed. I think also, to me, this is a critical time economically, because you bring a heifer into the herd, you calve her, and to have to cull her after she just weaned her first calf is both expensive and also emotionally expensive too, I think. You know, she's had her productive potential life ahead of her, and she's really failed at that first hurdle, or I guess you could say second hurdle. But to me, like, overmating heifers is if she doesn't get in calf, she's beef. But if she's calved, then and you have to kill her after that, then it's expensive. You can make the argument that you're still killing her as a once bred heifer, which is true, and she will probably grade as a heifer. But in practice, you're not going to really achieve optimal carcass outcomes from that animal. So, because if you want to do once bred heifers, you really have to specialise in it, and you've got to feed once bred heifers like racehorses if you're going to make a success of that system. So, yeah, it's still a very expensive time to have to cull that animal. Mixed age cows, what can we say? Well, I'm tempted to say a cow's a cow. But that is, remember, that's after you've taken out non-pregnant females at yearling and non-pregnant females as 2-year-olds. The data is sort of suggesting that a cow's a cow after that. But you've got to remember that this data for that age group of cows, they had fixed time AAI, the synchrony drugs. Were they impacting that reproduction? We only had limited numbers in terms of the numbers of progeny that were first born in 2015 that had come through the system and were far enough along the system at the time we did the data analysis to make that conclusion. And, you know, is it the same? Would you make the same conclusion in a hard year versus an easier year? So I guess I'm saying don't bank on that conclusion just yet. Don't maybe go out and quote me as saying a cow's a cow. But the evidence is sort of saying, well, once we've got the cow to that point and we've got her through that heifer mating and that 2-year-old mating, she's a lot more robust anyway, and there doesn't seem to be as much variation. But what about body condition of cows? So there's pretty significant variation in body condition as well. And this is the same sort of graph as what I showed earlier. So these columns again are all sires, and you can see that there is a range from about just over 6.5 sire average to about 7.25. So if you're looking at 2 individual cows, you say they're not that different. But if you're looking at a group of cows and the whole group's moved from, say, 6.5 to 7.1 or something like that, you'd actually say, well, that is a pretty significant shift. So there is actually a decent amount of variation in this body condition. Is that related to reproduction? So the only reproduction we can really look at is our 2-year-olds, because that's where we've got our genetic variation. So that 0.21 at the top of this matrix in the red box, that's the heritability that I showed before. So if we look at what's the genetic correlation of the ability of those animals or the days to conception of those animals as 2-year-olds with body condition scores of a heifer, of a 2-year-old cow, 2-year-old, which is the age that we're measuring this reproductive performance at, and as a mixed age cow, can't find much relationship. Even that minus 0.32, the standard error on that estimate is actually huge, and you could argue that it's no different to zero. But the other two, they're pretty close to zero. So actually, not a very good relationship genetically between body condition score measures and days to calving or reproduction, which matches what Wayne was saying before. And what about the body condition score measures themselves? So if you look down at, I don't know whether you can see my mouse, I hope you can, but if you look at the 0.87 down there, that's saying that the condition score of a 2-year-old is highly correlated to the condition score of a mixed age cow. So once you've calved, you're a cow. I'm quoting Wayne there. I don't think he said it tonight, but he says it a lot. Once you calved, you're a cow. When you look at it compared to the body condition score that we've measured on heifers a year earlier, and this was at mating time, actually the cow body condition score is significantly lower correlated with the heifer condition score. So at 0.55 or 0.61. So actually they're not quite the same thing from a genetics point of view. They're quite different, in fact. So how does cow body condition score relate to the fat measure? So Wayne talked about this a little bit as well. So if we look at our correlations between cow body condition score and rib fat depth measured by ultrasound on our steers and heifers, or carcass rib fat depth measured obviously at slaughter. For the ultrasound trait, the genetic correlation is 0.25. For the actual carcass trait, it's zero essentially. So what does that mean? Well, Wayne started with this quote, and I hear it all the time in New Zealand about, I want to select for positive fats. I want to look at positive fats on my EBVs. And normally when I hear that, people are saying the unsaid thing is because I want to put more fat on my cows, more body condition score on my cows. This correlation at 0.25 says, yeah, if you select on rib fat depth, you will put more body condition score on your cows, but it's a pretty blunt tool. It's not a good predictor, and it doesn't explain a whole lot of the variation there. So yes, it's the only tool you've got at this point, unless you are an Angus breeder in Australia. But right now, it's not a very good tool. There's a lot of unexplained variation with a genetic correlation of 0.25. You should still look at that carcass rib fat and think about it, but you should be thinking about it as much from a point of view of, do I need more fat on my finishing animals to get them to a level of finish that I'm happy with, or actually am I happy that my animals are finishing fast enough? And if you look at these values down here in terms of the carcass rib fat depths, some of these sires are means of just over 4.5. And I think our minimum specs are 3, but our desirable is probably more like 6 for what we want to put on. So you could argue that some of these sires in this data set are leaving progeny that are too lean, too hard to finish, or just not doing, I suppose, or not getting that finish on them. And what about eye muscle area? Because obviously cow body condition score is partly about fat, but it's also about muscle of the cow. A pretty big part of condition score is actually in muscle. But again, if you look at the eye muscle area by ultrasound measure, it's pretty poorly predictive of cow body condition score. So overall, our young animal measures, our measures on yearlings or 18-month cattle actually, because a lot of these scans were not done till a bit later, are not giving us a great prediction of what that cow will be like in terms of holding her condition. So last question is milk responsible for the variation in cow body condition score? So what's driving cow body condition score? And if we look at the correlation between our body condition score of cows and the maternal effect on weaning weight, which is the milk, what you see in your breed plan MBVs is the maternal effect on weaning weight. The genetic correlation of that is about minus 0.4 as a 2-year-old and minus 0.55 in mixed age cows. That means that we're explaining between about 16 and 30% of variation in cow body condition score by how much those cows are putting into their calves in terms of milk. So yes, milk is part of the picture in terms of cow body condition score, but again, it's far from the whole picture. So just think back to that last graph that Wayne showed with the green and the blue parts, and he made the point that actually there's a fair bit of variation in cow body condition score that's not explained by young animal traits. And I guess I'm saying a bit of that extra variation is explained by milk, but not by no means all of it. So there's something else to go there. And so what does that mean? It actually means that we should be measuring body condition score on our cows and evaluating it from a genetics point of view. So my take-home messages are actually very similar to Wayne's, and that's no coincidence. Well, obviously, we compare notes quite a bit across the Tasman. Cow body condition is important. It's important for reproduction at a phenotypic level or at a management point of view to get enough cows in condition to get them pregnant. From a genetics point of view, I think it's important because it's about cows that are easier to manage, perhaps require less feeding inputs, and there's also a welfare angle to this in terms of we don't want cows that are pushing themselves to the limit in terms of body condition score. And it's that sort of that robustness, that ability to keep on going in hard times. Cow body condition score from a genetic point of view is driven by multiple factors, but it's not that strongly related to the young animal measures, not nearly as much as what I think people believe it is based on what I see and how they select bulls, etc. Use the rib and rub fat measures primarily to describe finishing cattle because that's actually what they were designed for and that's what they measured on. So that is the primary use of those. Yes, don't go stripping the fat off your animals by going negative on those, I think, because we do need to keep animals to keep breeding animals that finish. We don't have a feedlot system in New Zealand, or not a large one anyway, so we don't have the Australian problem. So what those EBVs were originally designed to do was to take fat off around the outside when you were getting 30 mils after being on a feedlot, 30 mils of fat, take some of that fat off the outside, and then the IMF EBV was about putting it on the inside of the steak. So that's what they were designed to do, and actually, funnily enough, that's actually what they do best. For genetic improvement of fertility, I'm going to say the same thing as Wayne. Focus on days to calving, or days to conception was my version of it, or our version of it, but that's because of the data we had. And I would say if you're a bull breeder, measure it and report the EBV. So there's a bunch of catalogues out there that don't have it in them. And if you're buying bulls, look at it when you're selecting your bulls, and ask your breeder for it. So I think that's, the two messages are days to calving, and actually we need a cow body condition score, EBV. So Anna, I'll leave it there and hand it back to you.